Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa Blades, Professor of Political Science, and I'm also here as a faculty affiliate of the King Center on Global Development. I'm delighted to welcome an amazingly large audience here today to hear about the amazing work of three women who are seeking gender justice in the world and have been activists for this cause for many years. So the Stanford King Center is dedicated to stimulating research to alleviate global poverty and inform policy on critical development issues. So this requires a multidisciplinary, multifaceted approach, and the center focuses on supporting large-scale faculty initiatives as well as emerging scholars from across Stanford's 7 schools. The King Center also convenes stakeholders from across campus to engage in discussions of policy, and also to try to coordinate across both private and public sectors. The King Center Speaker Series features talks by distinguished scholars and policymakers. The goal of the series is to foster discussion about the successes and challenges in the field of poverty alleviation and development. Today's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the King Center website starting early next week. So today, we're going to be discussing how to successfully build opportunities for women around the world, to consider what strategies for empowering women have worked and where, when, under what circumstances, and can these strategies be adapted to work in other places. Each of our panelists today will have 5 minutes to talk a little bit about their priorities, their involvement with the issue of gender justice around the world, and to talk about what's motivating them in the current moment. Then we're going to have a more open-ended discussion where we're going to have some questions that were pre-registered with those of you who sent in your questions in advance, and also the opportunity to have questions submitted through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we can try to address some of those questions in real time. I apologize if I'm not able to get to everyone's question. So you may have noticed that all three of the panelists that we have today are connected in some capacity with Global Fund for Women. Global Fund for Women envisions a world where movements for gender equality and gender justice have transformed power and privilege from the few to the many. And we're going to have an amazing opportunity to hear actually from the founding president of Global Fund for Women, Firth Murray, who is also a consulting professor here at Stanford. Then we're going to have a chance to hear from the current CEO and president, Latanya Mapp Frett. And then we'll turn the discussion over to Mozn Hassan, who is the founder and executive director of Egypt's Nazra for Feminist Studies. And then we'll open it up to a broader discussion. So we're going to first hear from Anne.
Thank you very much. And thank you, King Center, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm delighted to be here, and especially with the Global Fund sisters. That's very nice. I'm going to read some notes that I wrote because I was just looking at some old materials, and I came across a little booklet that I wrote on a vision of empowerment for women. And I thought, well, that would be interesting, perhaps. And so let me read a little bit, and then we'll chat and interact, I hope. In the 1980s, some of us working on international development activities were thinking that the then current way of thinking about development issues was too often effective. And we needed new actors, primarily women and others, to enter that field. There were many groups out there, we knew that, effecting positive and impressive change. And we knew that a great number of them were women's groups. This was the realization that motivated us to begin to create a new organization, the Global Fund for Women, which would be dedicated to strengthening the position of women in their societies. The Global Fund would provide grants to hundreds of women's groups around the world, and it would do it in ways that would encourage freedom, creativity, and flexibility. The organization was based on a vision of mutual trust and respect, and a belief that women within their own cultures knew best how to proceed. From the beginning, we had the idea that although financial assistance may be important for effective international work, perhaps more important were the relationships that could develop, relationships based on a set of values that recognized women's wisdom, commitment, and dignity. In the early days, I was asked to concentrate on women. A short answer to that question is this: we concentrate on women because such a concentration is both important and right. Women worldwide within the family provide more health care than all official healthcare professionals combined, yet they suffer disproportionately from preventable illnesses related to poor nutrition, lack of basic education, and lack of access to primary health care. In many countries, women are the primary food producers, and yet they have lacked training to make maximum use of resources. In developing countries, and these statistics are possibly out of date, probably about 10 years out of date, not much change has happened, but in developing countries, as I noted in this little article, 2/3 of women over the age of 25 have never been to school. 130 million more women, adult women than men, cannot read or write. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Perhaps most important here, we wanted to introduce a women's perspective, the values and ethics that have come from women's experiences. We wanted to introduce this into the field of international work. And they're greatly needed as we attempt to make positive change in the world, we felt. The Global Fund for Women was founded in 1987. By 1989, an effective mechanism had been set up to give away money with as little hassle as possible, as little administrative hassle as possible. Systems were developed that provided for clear and rapid communication as well as accountability. It was necessary to describe program areas, and we concentrated on female human rights, which was our overarching interest, female human rights, and I can talk a little further about that, and women's access to communication and encouraging communication among women's groups. Finally, when we were putting together the Global Fund for Women, I spoke to a number of people in the field, and they said, you can't put together a women's organization without looking at economic autonomy. And we included that as our third little area of interest. But over time, our overarching interest was always female human rights. Okay, well, let's see. We didn't want to limit people with our program areas. In fact, we hoped that the Global Fund for Women would be the place to which women would turn when they had figured out what they wanted to do and could not obtain that support from anyone else. Supporting this freedom of thought and assisting women to come together to share and learn from each other, that very action of meeting, learning, and sharing, we thought in itself was empowering. And maybe we'll talk a little further about that and what we mean by empowerment today. I guess the focus on human rights, I just wanted to comment, reflected a central concern with the integrity of the body as a basic human right, especially as that was communicated from women's groups we were in touch with, that this was basically important. So we were hoping to take our cue from the women's groups themselves. They considered the work they did, even if it was on education or legal rights or health, they named it human rights. And that's why we basically took that category, or whatever we might call it, as our overarching program area. Over the years, we came to see our work, however, not only in the context of development and human rights, but also as empowerment, and further as basic to the actual health of civil society and democracy, democratic practices. The definition I used at the time for empowerment was having a vision, having a plan to carry out that vision, and being able to take the first steps toward implementing that plan. And I thought that that's what we were doing at the Global Fund for Women, intervening and responding to women's groups when they needed either to clarify their vision, which is so important to have clarity of vision, clarify their vision, or develop their plan, or in fact, take those first steps. Empowerment has also been defined as quote, releasing the power that people already have inside them. To do this, to release that power, we believed that it was necessary to create an environment of freedom where good things could happen, an environment for women of freedom where good things could happen. So that was my little description, and I don't know if I've used my 5 minutes, but I look forward to continuing to define what we mean by empowerment now, because it could mean almost anything, and hear of the more recent experiences of women through the Global Fund for Women, both in general and in Egypt. I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne. And going from the origins of the Global Fund to the contemporary, Latanya.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'm like sitting on the edge of my chair, hoping that everything you list out is things that you were hoping to do or things that we've been able to do. And Lisa, you didn't mention that Mozn is also on the board. She's a board of director of Global Fund for Women too. So we're all connected here. And I'm happy to say that so much of what you originally envisioned has held true at the Global Fund for Women. And that's not always the case at organizations, especially with NGOs that often have to turn their tide towards what donors do. But I do think that the nature of the organization and the mission and the vision has very much stayed aligned with where you were in 1987 and has continued to flourish and to show up. You mentioned, empowerment, I mean, look at Global Fund for Women is just a classic example of empowerment for women, I think, in every single way. And we can talk about that as we go. But you said that you always took the cues from the field, from women in the field who were doing the work. And I feel like that's why we're where we are now at Global Fund for Women. And so the things that, Lisa, you asked about the priorities. There's so many, but I do want to boil it down to the things that I think has been working for us at Global Fund for Women and why we continue to stay on task, if that's a good way to put it. But, quite frankly, our major issue right now, after having a year of reflection and talking to so many of our partners and advisors and whether they're resource partners or grantee partners about what's happening and what the needs continue to be. And we have landed on a strategy that is focused on movement building. And for those that don't use the lingo of movement, it is really talking about the collective action for social and systemic change. And we've seen, quite frankly, the research that shows not just the requests from the field, but research showing that when there's long-lasting social change, it was really driven by a grassroots movement. And you can track that now. You can see Laura Weldon, I think she's over in Vancouver now, has shown how you could look at that and how you can cut across various sectors and see that this change comes from these grassroots movements, and they're almost always led in some way or another by women. And so gender justice movement building is going to be very important for us. Making sure that support to collective action for social change is going to be extremely important to how we get our work done and how we get it to shifting power and privilege in this world from a few to very many. We continue to fund crisis, and that's something that, Anne, I'm not sure how much you guys did it then, but we have seen crises derail gender justice efforts, and so we want to focus in on that. So it's around the collective action primarily, but of course, when crises happen, and right now, quite frankly, we're living through one with COVID-19, we have to make sure that we get support to these same women's organizations on the grounds who often are the ones who bear the brunt of being able to support not just their families and communities, but quite frankly, the entire national structure when these things fall apart. But I am happy to say, Anne, that we, over the 30 plus years, have funded more than 5,000 organizations in 176 countries. And I think that it is such a privilege to be in this position, to be able to leverage a lot of that work that has happened with individual women's organizations concerned with human rights in their countries to now where we're talking about collective action to make real long-lasting systemic change. So that's really where my head is. And I know when we think movements, a lot of us think about Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Ni Una Menos, and some of those really sort of groundbreaking global movements, but quite frankly, movements are always local. They always start local, and then they become interconnected. It is the fabric of which a movement is made, and it is how the collective actors begin to challenge their opposition and to move forward. And so we continue to look for that lasting change, and we want to fund that work. But the other thing about movements is that they're also intersectional. And you talked a little bit about this, Anne, but cutting across different themes, right? So feminism in general is rooted in intersectionality. And we know there's no gender justice without racial justice, no racial justice without climate justice, and the list goes on, because women's lives aren't siloed in that way, and neither are movements, neither is the collective action. So in the US, we saw the growing movement for Black Lives Matter was successful, and there was a necessary reckoning, but it cut across all systemic and deep-seated racism that was going on in the country, whichever sector you found it in. And so we want to be clear and show that the evidence is that we have to cut across these sectors. We can't be so specific to one issue. And we talk to funders about this all the time, that we really have to focus on the issues that cut across those sectors, and not silo funding so that women only get it in one area, so they can only kind of run and work in one area. We want to be flexible so that they can be able to do the things that are necessary to cut down some of those systemic barriers across sectors. And so, that brings me to the other thing, which is intergenerational. Movements are intergenerational. And at Global Fund for Women, we really know that girls have always been organizing. Girls have always been working collectively in their communities and pushing back against daily oppressions and imagining new worlds for themselves and for us, right? So girls have to be at the forefront of many of the world's most powerful social justice movements. And we have to promote change that happens so that their ideas are much more accepted, that they have a much more authentic place at the table than sometimes we give them. And that we have to understand that girls remain extremely vulnerable, so need special protections in order for them to use their power at the table. And so we're supporting gender justice movements that include young women and girl-led movements. And we have an Adolescent Girls Advisory Council. For those of you that know Global Fund for Women, or can go to our site and you'll see who these girls are. And they're helping us figure out how we do grant making better, and how we move into, hopefully I'll be sitting where you are, Anne, in 30 years talking about what it was like when I was at the Global Fund for Women. But I do want to mention this intergenerational piece before I move it over to Mozn, because I think we have hundreds of Gretas out there, right? So we have, we lift up some of them in the world press, but everywhere I go, there's some young girl that's actually leading a process of systemic and long-term change. And we have to get behind that, we have to fund that, and we have to support that and lift that up. So I'll end there and look forward to the conversation. Thanks, Lisa.
So it's, the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and a lot of people have been talking about and thinking about the situation in Egypt. So it's really wonderful we have Mozn here to talk about feminist studies in Egypt and the movement that she's been building.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really, really thrilled to be with Latanya and speaking about the glory of Global Fund and generally, and I'm always admitting this, that I think that we in Nazra are the daughters of Global Fund. And honestly, me personally, I couldn't be in this position without this kind of support, which Anne has been describing about the idea of the Global Fund. Because when we began before the revolution as a new generation within our country at this time, we are coming from a region and a country which mainly has been co-opted. The question of women and feminism and gender has been co-opted by someone, either the state or some political groups or some assumptions about the international movement about who are the real Egyptian women, or who are the real Muslim women or Arab women, or all of these things. And when we began as a group, I couldn't forget when Zina Zaatari, the program director at this time, come to us, and she has been discussing with us our idea, and they gave us the core fund. And it was for us really the beginning, because we were living, and we are in our region living in this assumption and structure about how people internationally and the resources about us and for us are constructed. So for people, we have, while they want to not stereotype women, sometimes they are stereotyping the movements in certain ways. So we have to be collective, that all of us like this, how people are seeing sometimes their second generations in their countries, or who are authentic and who are not. But I do think that the Model Global Fund has been doing for years, and honestly, this for us has been helping us to begin our movement in this, not only the support and solidarity in this feminist idea, but also this type of grants about the core funding, about how you are leading your movement and how you are choosing how you are continue to do things. And this really helped in this also, the idea as group when we began, when the revolution came, because when the revolution came, things has been changing. We were asking for building a movement because our group mainly have been built in the idea that we believe that building the movement itself and the existence of the movement itself can lead to any change. So the core is the movement, because we can gain in region generally some rights, but because we don't have this stability and this context of so-called democratization or things, so most of the time you can lose it easily, or people can tell you most of the time that we gave it to you in this certain time, but it doesn't guarantee people after you. The movement is the core thing, to have us have our rights and continue to have it, but also asking for more. And I think this idea, and this ideology, honestly, being a feminist, believe in solidarity and believe in a feminist movement in our country, was the core issue to build what we have been doing in the last 10 years in our region and in our country. Because we came 10 years ago at these days, exactly at these days when Mubarak left, that, okay, Mubarak left, so what's after that? And creating a feminist discourse within a revolutionary time or changing time, or also understanding the reality, not only the glory, is something so important. So changes are bringing more violence in places which are not stable and democratized from the beginning. And I'm always advocating for this, that building the feminist movement is a tool of stabilization. Not only that we are nice and good and all these also stereotyped about women, but also because we are a non-violent movement from the beginning. We are the people who are kicked off all the time with all types of violence in the beginning as frontliners. And we understand what is violence, how the violence and the effects of this violence, and how peace, security, safety, democratization can help our long-term effect, not also our trend or our glory thing. If I continue in this protest of Loving Global Fund for Women, I think this idea made us in the last 10 years had an different big fights in our country and our region. And I'm always saying that I'm so proud to be an Egyptian feminist from this generation who have been fighting publicly and clearly and with all the strength, not only me, but part of this big movement, and which is creating, continued and building against sexual violence in our country. Because everyone internationally or any other places can think that it couldn't happen in Egypt. This resilience and this type of movement on certain things, most of the people seeing it as a taboo, or it doesn't suit us, as if other people have rights more than us, or any of these things. But we did it, that we keep with all the horrible incident happening in our lives personally and politically in the last 10 years that this movement is alive. And also from Nazra learned from being as part of Global Fund family is about building with others and on others, investing on others and with others. This also made that we are a group which is so targeted in Egypt, but at the same time, it's not about us. The movement is continuing. We have been working with people in the last 10 years and we are finding them now. They are leading their work in our country and also in the region. So you can find it in different places, the type of building the movement and the resilience we have been building also, and the deep solidarity we got. And I have to echo Latanya on this, believing in this intergenerational and solidarity is something so important not only emotionally as if you want to live as a feminist, but also practically that there are different people who have been building this before you, so you don't have to build from the beginning, just build on it. And this is also something I'm so happy and proud to be here, not only speaking about Global Fund and being with the founding member and the CEO, but also understanding what does it mean being from local, regional, and international. And this is one of the things I have been honored to be with the Global Fund board, as in this concept that how we can create our narratives, how our existence and our voices should be heard and listen to us. So what's happening now towards the question of how the movements have been building in different complicated places in this region. So look to what's happening to Yemen, how women there and feminists there have been building this movement to be on the table and speaking up. There were the first people who called to stop war, and now everyone, because Biden administration said that they have to stop war, so everyone's now speaking about stopping war. But this was the call from the feminists from the beginning, how the feminists in Lebanon are trying to overcome all this sectarian violence and all this problematic by having this cause on anti-sexual harassment law, citizenship law. It's not about the law or the right. It's about how there are certain things are deep. You can have different people on it. And this is the issue about the feminist movement. I don't want to speak a lot, but I think also thinking about those countries as examples, thinking about the Syrian women who are trying to write their constitution now, so having their rights within their constitution is something can bring a democratic constitution generally, and thinking about how the movement has been building in Gulf now with all the stereotype that those women don't need us. Those women couldn't be feminists by any way, but now we have Lujain al-Hazlul who is temporarily out, and we have different feminists from Saudi Arabia who are still in jail because they asked for something so basic for others. But it's important all the time, and I think this is the rule of places like this, but also this is how we have been going through the journey with Global Fund, that they are listening, and it should give the movement the resources to say and speak and try. And the core fund is about try and don't be afraid. It's not big money and we don't have many demands, but just try with this system of solidarity. So I think with all these things and thinking and being proud really, not only to be part of the Global Fund, but also being a person who can share all the time because I have accessibility more than others, but to understand that this region have many different women and diverse women and feminist movements, like Sarah Ahmed has been mentioning in her book, Living as a Feminist, is something so important. It will enrich the discussion, the understanding, and I'm calling, when I'm sitting in any international setting, that listen to us and let us put our agenda, our policies, our priorities, and this will be more strategic and really be more right. Sorry, I spoke too much and you didn't cut me off.
Mozn, there's actually a question from one of our registered attendees that I think you would probably be well positioned to answer, which is a question of how to promote women's rights, gender egalitarianism without infringing on cultural norms and practices. And you alluded to this a little bit in your discussion in terms of the listening, the importance of being a good listener. Do you have some thoughts for Janine?
I think it's also important not to be stereotyped about what's culture, because it's easy. I think one of the good things for me personally to live as a feminist and think as a feminist all the time, that it brings me not to be this, what we call it, this black and white person. There are all the time things in between. So culture, because we have been in the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, as experience in Egypt, that you couldn't have feminists, local feminists. You are either westernized people or you are those upper middle class women who are so connected to the state, or you are part of certain political groups. You have the agenda of these certain political groups. And I do think that it's a stereotype. It's a stereotype in a country which from 1919, we have this discussion and these sacrifices about feminism in our country. And honestly, because we came from this positionality that we understand our history, we understand that cultures are not static because societies are not static. And also this can make us all these years struggling and honestly fighting and paying prices against the Islamists when they were ruling Egypt, against the securitized, militarized people when they wanted to co-opt our question and our rights and our body, and against such conservative political groups who also wanted to co-opt us. So it's important while thinking about culture to think about what does it mean culture, from which group, and does it mean if there is something which is common culture that we are not authentic from our countries. And honestly, the experience brought something else, that we have now feminists who are calling themselves feminists, and honestly I'm seeing them more radical than me in feminism, coming from different governorates in Egypt. You have never thought before the revolution, and it's not about that the revolution was good, it's about that the opening in the public sphere and the acceptance for new people and people out of the usual suspects to speak up brought those into our eyes.
Anne, did you want to say something on this question of culture?
I do too, yeah. Go ahead, Anne. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, on that question of that question of interrupting culture or going against culture was raised with me from the very beginning when we began the Global Fund. Oh, you're going in, you're trying to change the culture, and so on and so forth. But culture is not monolithic. I mean, culture is many different things in most countries. And as I explained, we didn't intervene, we responded. We responded to women's groups who were part, after all, of the culture. And as Mozn just suggested or said, it's multicultural. Culture is a multi thing. It's made up of many different groups and many different beliefs in any given country. And there were plenty of women's groups in those countries that were part of the culture.
And I'll just add, because as Mozn knows, I worked for the U.S. government in Egypt for some years. And, and this was exactly the excuse that was given why we should not support local human rights groups from the government of Egypt, right? It was that, this was a cultural issue, and it was not for foreign assistance funds to be used in those ways. And when I look back on my career, I definitely wish we had been able to invest more in organizations that would have been able to stand the test of time through the Arab Spring, because a lot happened, of course, and the support that would be required, and I don't mean just in Egypt, but in any country going through something like this, was really not there for those organizations. And it became very difficult for any of us to be able to continue supporting that work from where we sat. And so I think we just have to be careful. And I just wanted to, and I think it's the same thing Anne is saying when we talk about culture, what we're actually talking about and what we're actually preventing, because we've seen our opposition using this so much to the denigration, quite frankly, of women and girls who are trying to do work in those countries. And so I want us to be careful. I agree with Anne. There is no room for misinterpreting culture when it is the actual members of society, in this case, women, who are leading that effort, and we are following. We're trying to support. And so it's a different case. We're not trying to recreate culture. We're trying to support groups that are trying to make changes in their lives, and quite frankly, who are being, ostracized for wanting to change certain social systems and structures that continue to put them at the vulnerability of the world. And so I support, social change when it's necessary and when it comes from local actors.
Latanya, I have a question for you from one of our faculty members in the Graduate School of Education, Christine Min-Witowka, who's asking something that's related very closely maybe to your previous experience in government, which is what types of changes do you think will happen in terms of US foreign policy with the new administration as related to gender justice around the world? And do you have some thoughts on why the US may lag behind other countries in terms of our own gender justice issues, women's representation in Congress, head of state, et cetera?
Yeah, no, and thank you for the question. I'm excited about this administration, like I think many of us are, and looking for the opportunities to hold it accountable for what it campaigned for. And in some cases, because it's a continuation of a previous administration under the Obama administration, we do know many of the people, and we do hope that we'll see significant change. I think where we may have seen in the past that we didn't just go far enough. For instance, the global gag rule is just a huge, outlier out there. And that was the Mexico City policy that said that we can't talk about and or refer a termination of pregnancies in countries where we work, whether we were spending US government money or not, has had a huge impact on clinics that serve women, in particular clinics in very rural areas where they may be the only healthcare that women are getting. And so what we saw basically was that we didn't have enough information to be able to tell the story of how this was hurting women. And we have partners. I know we have the group Rhythm of Life in Uganda, who has been very vocal about how this one US policy has really hurt the work that they're trying to do. And she works in HIV/AIDS, but she sits by silently and angrily and watch girls and women in Uganda die of unsafe abortion. And so that is a US policy that can be changed. We tried to change it permanently in the previous Obama administration and just couldn't get it done. And our hope is that we can see that happen now. We should never have a policy in the US, talk about culture, where we take our anxieties around something and place it on women, girls, governments, and other countries, and actually remove funds because of that purpose. So I do think this administration is hopefully going to do well, and we certainly want to support that, and we will certainly hold them accountable for what they have already said that they can do. But I will say, when we talk about why the US is not doing as well as one might think as a quote unquote, developed country when it comes to gender justice, it goes back to what I was talking about, where our intersectional inequalities. I mean, we have huge issues around race, so racial justice, climate justice. There is still half this population in this country that don't believe that climate change is an issue. So, we've got a lot to work on when it comes to these intersectional inequalities. It's not going to be easy for us to get to political participation of women if you can't see yourself being led by a woman of color, right? So it's all of these issues coming together that continue to keep us down. And once we address these inequalities together, I think we'll be able to get to a much better place. And hopefully this administration will be able to start that process and that journey for us.
I have a really important question from a Stanford student named Maria, who asks about backlash when you're pursuing gender justice around the world. What types of backlash have you observed in women's communities? What types of strategies might be used in the face of backlash to your movements? And maybe we can start with Anne.
Well, I don't have a good answer to that question because I have been actually surprised by how little backlash there has been in the areas in which I've worked. I mean, from the beginning of the Global Fund, people often would ask me this, and we would ask grantees we considered them, and they were brave, coming out in their countries for freedoms of all kinds. I'm surprised and have been surprised over these many years at how little backlash I have heard of, or even, and certainly how little backlash I have received being a feminist and an outspoken feminist.
Latanya.
Yeah, and love to hear from Mozn, of course, is one who I feel like has been under threat. But, I do feel like it's gotten a bit sophisticated. So, governments won't necessarily say, or religious leaders even, we have a problem with the progress of women, of empowering women is a bad thing, So nobody says that outright. But, look at their numbers. We talked about the US a minute ago. Look at how they treat LGBTQI and trans women, so those are the things, when you look at those who are the most marginalized in a community, that's where you really see the backlash, in my opinion. And that's how you judge the backlash, how powerful it is, how many people believe in that and subscribe to it. And that's from where you work. Where I think it's most challenging, though, is violence. And I think Mozn got to that, against particularly women and voices. We've seen so much of it across the world. When women have stood up and have resisted the type of violence they experience. We've seen it in wars where sexual violence has become the number one attempt to try to change things in that regard has been very difficult. And so, it is, in my opinion, this is the kind of things that we have to do is really hear from the women directly themselves. And that's why I said hearing from Mozn is so important on this call. We also have, and I just want to make sure people have seen the Fundamental film series, which is actual activists from 5 different countries. And you can go to the Global Fund for Women's site to see it, but it's called fundamental-film.com. And these are women from 5 different countries talking about how they have resisted and how they have come out of it. I think without hearing the stories, it's difficult to understand what women are dealing with and or how they actually address some of this violence. And so, yeah, go ahead, Anne. Yeah.
No, I have to swallow all my words now that Latanya has spoken. But when I thought of backlash, I was thinking of direct discrimination against an individual person for speaking out. But yes, the ongoing, especially violence, but ongoing discrimination against women may be considered backlash. I don't know, but that to me is just part of our ongoing battle.
Wilson.
Yeah, I think it's so tough to speak about such a thing, but I do think that we couldn't see anything out of the context, and the context which also can define what's backlash, because most of the people, I do think that what we have been in our region, and I can speak about my country and some places of our region, I think that all of the time we have a backlash. We have a backlash because we are a movement which doesn't have a back, which doesn't have allies. And this is something so problematic. And because of that, we have been living with this also dynamics within the movement that when one of us can be considered more radical than others, so others could defend themselves by saying that we are not look like her. And this is something of the dynamics of the abused people. And while you are living in a context which is not giving rights mainly, it's also something problematic. Yani I can say clearly that I'm a person who have been for years under a deep threat and targeting from the state, some political groups, societal groups, because also it's also about the type of issues you are speaking about, because living within a patriarchal conservative societies, they also want you to look to be, you know, this what we call the right good feminist. This right good feminist could, and I don't say that those people are not targeted. This is sometimes our assumption that if we can be right good people, they will love us or they will accept us more. I think no, we are living within the southern countries in a systematic backlash, and this is also something about seeing this and seeing the movement alive. And honestly, as someone who's believing in the movement building for years, I have been thinking twice and 3 times in 10 years of the revolution, is this movement about bringing more survivals or about protecting more survivals? Because while seeing the context, which is not helping all the time, is something make you rethink about how those women are extraordinary. And I am in this thread, but I'm thinking for my fellow feminists who are lived in the jails of Mohammed bin Salman in 3 years. And I'm thinking of my friends who are back in my wall now, who are in jail now. It's not about the priority of the backlash, it's about the context itself, the context of accepting this independent movement also to be different and have its issues. I think thinking about the backlash is also about the context. So now we are living in a more violent world generally. We live in a pandemic. We live in place which is all opportunities are less. Women are facing more, feminists are facing, we are living in a region which has almost 2/3 of it have war. Others have political instability and societal violence. So it's hard to say that we will not face this backlash. I think we have to understand the backlash and also understanding where we should ask not to be more survivals for people to understand us. And this is sometimes it's not the power. The power is to stand and say that we need a safe public community and public sphere to work within.
And you mentioned the pandemic. We received multiple questions from our participants today about how the global pandemic has exacerbated challenges associated with women's rights, the encouragement of female labor force participation, but might there also be some opportunities associated with the current moment in the pandemic for the movement for gender justice? So why don't we start with Anne, then go to Latanya and Mozn, if you guys have anything you want to say about this question.
I would have just a quick response because I really don't know very much about what the effects have been at all. But I do know that violence against women, domestic abuse as it's sometimes called, violence against women has risen hugely in all countries that are, noting it, and certainly in this country and in Great Britain, where they have actually studied it quite clearly. Domestic abuse, domestic violence has increased significantly. And why is that? Because women are home alone or alone with their potential abuser, or who knows, people have to have to take it out on someone because they're feeling lonely or upset, they've lost their jobs, who knows? But the basic data is that it's increased hugely.
Latanya.
And I might note that
apologies, Anne.
So no, I was going to say that sometimes people ask, what issue do you think is most important? I think this issue of violence is, to me, an absolute central issue. Violence is the strategy that people use to maintain control or to increase their control. their power. And it's therefore a very, very important and difficult issue. I think it's central to any discussion of women's rights and health.
Thank you, Anne. Latanya, any thoughts on this question about pandemic and the fight for global justice for women?
Yeah, and I want to be respectful of context, because we see different things happening in different places, but overall, we have seen that women in marginalized communities across the world have been harder hit, because of the pandemic. But it also makes me want to realistically say they were the same groups, in 2019 who were suffering the hardest in their communities. And, and I agree with Anne about, domestic violence, having been heightened and almost in my opinion, for humanist, in an embarrassing way, what we've been seeing with violence in the homes and issues that have not been taken care of, I think, or addressed by our governments in a long time. But I also want to, just point out the heightened caregiving burden that we've seen with women, and knowing, firsthand, and as many of us on this call, of what it looks like to be able to hold down a full-time job, to be able to now do homeschooling when we hadn't done that before, and manage all that's happening, and then think about that for frontline workers who are having to still go outside the house. A lot of us have close friends who, do have to go to work. They're not sitting on Zooms all day, and their kids are home, without care. So I think, all of these policies are still being thought through, still being researched. But in the meantime, at Global Fund for Women, we know we have to be able to help women's groups who are trying to address these issues for their communities. And so we do have a crisis fund that we have been able to keep flexible. So our funding, of course, is core long-term flexible funding. And so we've said to many of our grantees that you use the money for the COVID response as you see needed. And then we've been able, through generous donations, to be able to offer more funds to women who need additional funds to do different and maybe more initiatives in the work. They're doubling down around racial justice and the response from police around brutality around the world. Information, so important. Water and sanitation, of course, crucial during a pandemic, but of course also providing, as I probably mentioned, the reproductive health services that have been cut off by many places. And of course, the domestic violence shelters that many women are having to lift up and to include more spaces for women who are experiencing that violence. So, yeah.
Mozn, any particular issues related to the feminist movement in Egypt associated with the pandemic?
I think many problems about the feminist movement in our region and in our country relating to the pandemic that we from the beginning are portrayed as we are not an important issue. And we're speaking about not important issues. So while you are in the pandemic, from this movement building thing, you have this double pressure that you are not important. But I think this is something so complicated in entering this gender discussion and gender problems within the pandemic, which became for us, I think that it became for us, all of us, as the narrative of this world and the COVID, then what and what and what. And also there is something politically about this, that our people who are ruling in our region are using the pandemic to put more pressure on us as movements. And the people internationally are buying by their will their arguments about there are many things more than those 5 feminists who are in jail, or those 10 feminists who are in travel ban. Why she wants to travel now? There is no one is traveling. Why it's important to have people and offices and movement to exist while everyone is staying at home. So I think this is something about the movement and our context is something so important, that people are using this pandemic as privilege on us. And it's also taking from our resources as a movement, and also our resources on the issues. So why do you want now to speak about how there is a problem in the rape kits in Egypt. So everyone will speak with you about we don't have enough budget for the Ministry of Health to have something about the COVID. So it's more complicated in the daily, but at the same time using it as a narrative for people to get away from their crimes is something so alarming, and it will really affect the movement. And also some people, even from our movements, yani, as the human rights movement or the development movement, have been asking if we are important or not. So now we have to be back to be caregivers or charity people, or this people who only give service and direct services. So why you want to be the sophisticated feminist at this time? So it's more complicated, I think, and it needs many time to see others, but these are my main thoughts of working within this context.
So much. So we're running relatively short on time, and I want to give you guys each a chance to sort of give a sense to our audience of how they can be the most effective they can be in supporting women's empowerment around the world. Are there any tips, ideas? Are there ways that men can get involved and become allies of the movement? And then if there are any final thoughts that you want to add as well in our last few minutes here as a group. So why don't we go in the order we began, which will be Anne, Latanya, and then Mozn.
Oh dear, I'm not exactly devoid of ideas, but I'm not quite sure what I want to say as a final thing. First of all, there are some chat comments here that are directed toward us, a couple of people who want to be in touch. We want to perhaps respond to those. I'm probably going to sound very touchy-feely in what I'm about to say, but I'm often asked, what can we do? What can we do about all of this? How can we really deal with violence and all this these things? I think, and I say to my students when they ask me this, that the one thing we have control over is in fact ourselves and how we lead our lives and how we interact with people. And as I said, I sound rather Pollyannish or touchy-feely or something by saying this, but I think that we need to express kindness and love all the time toward people, toward our friends, our colleagues, our students, and to the extent that we have powerful platforms, which I think some of us do, we can attempt to do this. And I am reminded, and I'm reminded of something I tend to quote when I'm asked to speak, and that is the definition of love by Thich Nhat Hanh. And Thich Nhat Hanh expressed 4 mantras that he considered sort of added up to true love. And they really are guideposts, I think, or should be. And for me, they are. So these mantras were, dear one, I am here for you. That's the first mantra. The second, not in any order of importance, dear one, I see you and it makes me happy. Third one, dear one, I see that you're in pain and that is why I am here for you. And the fourth, dear one, I am in pain, please help me. I feel that those mantras, if we could take them to heart, would go a long way toward answering some of the questions that are in the chat, for example, and in trying to summarize what can we actually do.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. That was really lovely. Latanya.
Yeah, it was, Anne, and I think that's the basis of which we have to start. I do want, for those that continue to have questions, to visit us online at globalfundforwomen.org. We talk a lot about our collective organizing, rights for workers, for women who are working both from home and other places, and also to talk more about how do we ensure safe, just, and equitable conditions for women everywhere. And I do think, and I'll end with this, that we have a commitment to continue to be educated. I know sometimes the pandemic has made us more insular as a society as we think about what's happening next door and in our direct communities, but we have to stay educated about what's happening around the world because we are part of a world community. And as donors, as many of us give to these issues, I think it's going to be super important for us to understand what's happening, and thank Mozn in particular for being able to have this time with us. And then think about some of the issues beyond the pandemic that will need immediate addressing, like climate change, like racial injustice. And so keeping all of those things, as I talked about, the intersectional inequalities on our mind, because otherwise we'll get out of one thing and right back into another. And so I do think, and that's across the board, men or women, to continue to challenge our leaders on how we address some of these, and then ourselves stay educated on what we can do from our own perch to be able to make things better. Thank you for this, Lisa.
Latanya, Mozn, any words of wisdom for how to be effective and final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are, while we are in this setting, I'm always, when I've been within this academic setting, I'm really asking student professors and people who are studying us that they can be more engaged scholars more than this, and to understand the movement and the work. And honestly, I do think that many of the studies and the discussion about our gender movements in our region is really behind what is the reality is happening. I'm really asking people to this, and really I'm asking you to not to deal with us as interlocutors, because we have been spending many hours, personally I have been spending many hours in my life sitting with different researchers and other people discussing the movement and other things, and honestly most of those people, when they ended their work, even they didn't bother to send me a copy of what they published. And this is something so problematic. It's really so problematic. And I was thinking many times that why I'm spending this time with those people, honestly. But I do think that having our narratives also not to deal with us as interlocutors, deal with us as part of this, and we can produce knowledge. Maybe it's not this academic, but we are producing knowledge because we are doing our interventions based on a logic and theory and beliefs and understanding. This is one of the things. Other thing, as you in the US have new administration, you have been in this changing, I think thinking deeply about our situation, our region, and centers like you and other things to advise the public about also our reality, and listen to feminists, because it's important, because people all the time in the changes, the least people they are listening to are the feminists. They're coming to the politician, the human rights activists, the people, they are not speaking to us because we will come once. And the third thing, I think I'm seconding Anne on this, that maybe people don't think that solidarity matters, but honestly it matters. As a person who have been almost 5 years in travel ban and this targeting, solidarity matters, because this is something really, really important. And I think this is one of the best being a feminist, that you know the solidarity and also you know the constructive solidarity. And this is something in this relationship with the Global Fund and others. So thank you.
I think that one of the amazing things about these Zoom forums is they give us a chance to feel that solidarity to some degree. So many questions and comments coming in, people wanting to get involved, wanting to be in touch with you, wanting to be in touch with the Global Fund moving forward. So thank you all. Thank you, our amazing speakers, for your time, for your expertise. Thank you to those of you who were able to attend today. The video event will be up on the website shortly. You guys will be able to watch it again if you want, or show your friends. And so we look forward to seeing you and welcoming you at a future King Center event. Thank you.